Hey, welcome back to Mr. Smith Reads. Where we left things off last time, our character, Nobody Owens, had just escaped the man Jack. The man Jack had been sent to kill Nobody Owens' family. And little baby Nobody walked all the way to a graveyard up on a hill and was saved by the ghost of the graveyard. We shall continue forth with part 2 of chapter 1 of The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Mrs. Owens waited outside the funeral chapel. It had been decreed over 40 years before that the building, in appearance a small church with a spire, was a listed building of historical interest. The town council had decided that it would cost too much to renovate it, a little chapel and an overgrown graveyard that had already become unfashionable. So they padlocked it, and they waited for it to fall down. Ivy covered it, but it was solidly built, and it would not fall down this century. The child had fallen asleep in Mrs. Owens' arms. She rocked it gently, sang it an old song one her mother had sung to her when she was a baby herself, back in the days when men had first started to wear powdered wigs. The song went, "Sleep, my little baby, oh, sleep until you're waken. When you're grown, you'll see the world, if I'm not mistaken. Kiss a lover, dance a measure, find your name in buried treasure." And Mrs. Owens sang all that before she discovered that she had forgotten how the song ended. She had been feeling that the final line was something in a way of, "and some hairy bacon," but that might have been another song altogether. So she stopped, and instead she sang him the one about the man in the moon who came down too soon, and after that she sang in a warm country voice a more recent song about a lad who had put his thumb in and pulled out a plum. And she had just started a long ballad about a young country gentleman whose girlfriend had, for no particular reason, poisoned him with a dish of spotted eels, when Silas came around the side of the chapel carrying a cardboard box. "Here you go, Mistress Owens," he said. "Lots of good things for a growing boy. We can keep it in the crypt, eh?" The padlock fell off in his hand, and he pulled open the iron door. Mrs. Owens walked inside, looking dubiously at the shelves and at the old wooden pews tipped up against a wall. There were mildewed boxes of old parish records in one corner, and an open door that revealed a Victorian flush toilet in the basin with a cold tap in the other. The infant opened his eyes and stared. "We can put the food in here," said Silas. "It's cool and the food will keep longer." He reached into the box and pulled out a banana. "And what would that be when it was at home?" asked Mrs. Owens, eyeing the yellow and brown object suspiciously. "It's a banana, a fruit from the tropics. I believe you peel the outer covering," said Silas, "like so." The child, Nobody, wriggled in Mrs. Owens' arms, and she let it down to the flagstones. It toddled rapidly to Silas, grasped his trouser leg, and held on. Silas passed it the banana. Mrs. Owens watched the boy eat. "Banana," she said, dubiously. She had never heard of them. Never. "What's it taste like?" "I've absolutely no idea," said Silas, who consumed only one food, and it was not bananas. "You could make up a bed in here for the boy, you know." "I'll do no such thing, with Owens and me having a lovely little tomb over by the daffodil patch. Plenty of room in there for a little one. Anyway," she added, concerned that Silas might think she was rejecting his hospitality, "I wouldn't want the lad to disturb you." He wouldn't." The boy was done with his banana. What he had not eaten was now smeared over himself. He beamed messy and apple-cheeked. "Nah," he said happily. "What a clever little thing he is," said Mrs. Owens. "And such a mess he's made. Why, attend, you little wriggler." And she picked the lumps of banana from his clothes and his hair. And then, what do you think they'll decide? "I don't know. I can't give him up, not after what I promised his mama." "Although I have been a great many things in my time," said Silas, "I have never been a mother, and I do not plan to begin now, but I can leave this place." Mrs. Owens said simply, "I cannot. My bones are here, and so are Owens's. I'm never leaving." "It must be good," said Silas, "to have somewhere that you belong, somewhere that's home." There was nothing wistful in the way he said this. His voice was drier than deserts, and he said it as if he were simply stating something unarguable. Mrs. Owens did not argue. "Do you think we'll have to wait long?" "Not long," said Silas, but he was wrong about that. Up in the amphitheater on the side of the hill, the debate continued, that it was the Owenses who had gotten involved in this nonsense, rather than some flibberty-gibbet Johnny-come-latelys counted for a lot, for the Owenses were respectable and respected. And Silas had volunteered to be the boy's guardian, had weight. Silas was regarded with a certain wary awe of the graveyard folk, existing as he did on the borderland between their world and the world they had left. But still, a graveyard is not normally a democracy, and yet death is the great democracy, and each of the dead had a voice and an opinion as to whether the living child should be allowed to stay, and they were each determined to be heard that night. It was late autumn when the daybreak was long in coming. Although the sky was still dark, cars could now be heard starting up and further down the hill. As the living folk began to drive to work through the misty night black morning, the graveyard folk talked about the child that had come to them and what had to be done. 300 voices, 300 opinions. Nehemiah Trott, the poet from the tumbled northwestern side of the graveyard, had begun to declaim his thoughts on the matter, although what they were no person listening could have said, when something happened. Something to the silence, each opinionated mouth, something unprecedented in the history of the graveyard. A huge white horse, of the kind that people who know horses would call a gray, came ambling up the side of the hill. The pounding of its hooves could be heard before it was seen, along the crashing it made as it pushed through the little brushes and thickets, through the brambles and the ivy and the gorse that had grown up the side of the hill. The size of a shire horse it was, a full 19 hands or more. It was a horse that could have carried a knight in full armor into combat. And all it carried on its naked back was a woman clothed from head to foot in gray. Her long skirt and her shawl might have been spun from old cobwebs. Her face was serene and peaceful. They knew her, the graveyard folk, for each of us encountered the Lady of the Gray at the end of our days, and there is no forgetting her. The horse paused beside the obelisk in the east. The sky was lightening gently, a pearlish pre-dawn luminescence that made the people of the graveyard uncomfortable and made them think about returning to their comfortable homes. Even so, not one of them moved. They were watching the lady on the gray, each of them half excited, half scared. The dead are not superstitious, not as a rule, but as they watched her as a Roman augur might have watched the sacred crows circle, seeking wisdom, seeking a clue. And she spoke to them. In a voice like the chiming of 100 tiny silver bells, she said only, "The dead should have charity." And she smiled. The horse, which had been contentedly ripping up and masticating a clump of thick grass, stopped then. The lady touched the horse's neck, and it turned. It took several huge, clattering steps. Then it was off the side of the hill and cantering across the sky. Its thunderous hooves became an early rumble of the distant thunder, and at moments it was lost to sight. That, at least, was what the folk of the graveyard who had been on the hillside that night claimed had happened. The debate was over and ended, and without so much as a show of hands had been decided. The child called Nobody Owens would be given the freedom of the graveyard. Mother Slaughter and Josiah Worthington Bart accompanied Mrs. Owens to the crypt of the old chapel, and they told Mrs. Owens the news. She seemed unsurprised by the miracle. "That's right," she said. "Some of them don't have a ha'porth sense in their heads, but she does. Of course she does." Before the sun rose on the thundering gray morning, the child was fast asleep in the Owens' little fine tomb, for Master Owens had died the prosperous head of the local cabinet makers guild, and the cabinet makers had wanted to ensure that he was properly honored. Silas went out for one final journey before sunrise. He found the tall house on the side of the hill, and he examined the 3 bodies he had found there, and he studied the pattern of the knife wounds. When he was satisfied, he stepped out into the morning's dark, his head churning with unpleasant possibilities, and he returned to the graveyard, to the chapel spire where he slept and waited out the days. In the little town at the bottom of the hill, the man Jack was getting increasingly angry. The night had been one that he had been looking forward to for so long, the culmination of months, of years of work, and the business of the evening had started so promisingly. 300 people down before any of them had even a chance to cry out. And then it had all gone so maddeningly wrong. Why on earth had he gone up the hill when the child had so obviously gone down the hill? By the time he had reached the bottom of the hill, the trail had gone cold. Someone must have found the child and taken it in, hidden it. There was no other explanation. A crack of thunder rang out, loud and sudden as a gunshot, and the rain began in earnest. The man Jack was methodical, and he began to plan his next move. The calls he would need to pay on a certain of the townsfolk, people who would be his eyes and ears in the town. He did not need to tell the convocation he had failed. Anyway, he told himself, edging under a shop front as the morning rain came down like tears, that he had not failed. Not yet. Not for years to come. There was plenty of time. Time to tie up the last piece of unfinished business. Time to cut the final thread. It was not until the police sirens sounded the first a police car, then an ambulance, then an unmarked police car with a siren blaring sped past him on their way up the hill that reluctantly the man Jack turned up his collar of his coat, put his head down, and walked off into the morning. His knife was in his pocket, safe and dry inside its sheath, protected from the misery of the elements. Stay with us as we read chapter 2 next time.